Okay, thanks everybody for joining. This is our second session on privacy and intellectual property in precision agriculture and in infrastructure. The presentation will be on privacy and intellectual property challenges associated with the use of drones. Jamie Nafziger, a partner in our trademark group, will be presenting. For over 18 years, Jamie has helped clients grow their businesses by developing stellar brands, advertising their products and services, and launching cutting-edge online services and mobile apps. She has many clients in the agriculture and energy industries and has advised clients in connection with the commercial use of drones and the legal issues surrounding developing and launching precision agriculture software systems and apps. She chairs the firm's cybersecurity, privacy, and social media practice group and has been named to the top 250 women in IP by Managing Intellectual Property and awarded Author of the Year E-Commerce USA by Lexicology. Jamie grew up in dairy country in Wisconsin and then spent 10 years in the San Francisco Bay Area before starting at Dorsey.
Thanks, Bridget. Welcome everybody today. This has been a big week for drones, and I know we have some members of the media here and viewing the webinar today, and I send a welcome to them. I did want to ask that, although my comments can definitely be on the record, that any questions we get or answers will be off the record unless you talk to us afterwards. So Earth is expecting a massive population growth in the coming years, and humanity is looking for ways to produce more food on Earth. Drones can help with that. We're also looking for ways to produce energy efficiently and to reduce our water use where we can, and drones can help with that too. Imagine that I run a large solar farm in Southern California out in the desert. Because my farm is really large, I use 5 drones on my property to help me. And because I love to name robots, I've decided to name my drones. So I've got Speedy, I've got the 3 orderly brothers, and I've got one called Anguish. And I'll tell you about what these drones do for me. So Speedy is pretty amazing because she can fly out over all my solar panels at 50 miles an hour, and because she has infrared thermal imaging cameras, she can sense which panels are malfunctioning. And I can then fix them or replace them so that I can keep my farm operating at the peak solar energy production. So thank you to Speedy for that. The other great thing about what she does is she can do in one day what humans with handheld sensors would take days or even weeks to do. The 3 orderly brothers are drones that are fitted with brushes, and they can go out over my solar panels and clean them gently. What they can do is, if the solar panels are clean, and because I'm out in the desert, there's lots of dust and dirt and grime, I can produce 35% more energy with a clean solar panel than I can with a dirty one. So the orderly brothers replace humans with other more clunky robots that were using water to clean my solar panels. So they are both more efficient and also save water. So thank you to them. Anguish, unfortunately, her job fits with her name, and her job is to fly around my property and look for dead wildlife. It's a sad truth of running a solar farm that we concentrate the energy to 800 degrees, and any bird that flies into that is not likely to survive. So part of my environmental regulation compliance reporting is that I have to report these dead bodies. So Anguish flies around and looks for those and counts them up for me, and is very helpful in my business as well. So I've talked about 3 positive uses of drones. My presentation today is going to talk about even more, and we'll also talk about the legal issues that they raise, most specifically intellectual property and privacy issues. So I talked about some examples of infrastructure uses. I want to turn to agriculture. And the way that drones are used the most in agriculture is in precision agriculture. And I'm assuming with our audience today that everybody knows what that is. But just in case we have some who don't, I'll give a quick description of it. It's the use of technology to collect and process real-time site-specific data and use that to inform farming decisions. And the key things here are real-time, so that it's happening the day that you're out on the farm, and secondly, that it's site-specific. And by that I don't mean an entire farm, I mean different sections of a farm. And the reason that the word precision is included is that you may be able to treat different sections of your farm differently based on this information you collect, and either reduce the inputs you're using, adjust your watering, or that sort of thing. So imagine if you could connect your irrigation system to weather predictions and only water when it isn't going to rain. Or you pick different seed choices for different areas of your farm based on what will grow the best and what the drones can help you figure out about that. Or apply different amounts of pesticides or fertilizer depending on which parts of your farm need it the most on that day. So what do you need in order to do that? Well, drones are just part of the infrastructure that you need to do precision agriculture. You need a bunch of different hardware. So drones would be one thing you could use. The sensors and cameras that drones carry or could be carried on other types of equipment are important. Smart farm equipment, so you could have a combine or a planter or irrigation system that is not only doing its farming function, but also sensing, mapping, giving you information, and connecting to the internet as well. Communication systems, some things can be done with USB sticks, but others are done with Wi-Fi or cellular. Mobile devices, now you'll see farmers with tablets and smartphones communicating with drones and other devices that they're using. And satellites provide important imagery that's used in precision agriculture as well. Software, you've got mobile apps, you've got cloud-based software. You have people, so producers, it could be either the owner of the property or the person who's renting it to farm there. You've got the drone operators, which we've heard a lot about this morning already. Crop specialists, such as agronomists, who might be out helping you figure out what you want to apply to your farm. And the applicators, such as aerial applicators or people who are driving equipment on your farm. You also probably want to connect with databases of information that already exist. So mapping databases, weather databases. You might test your soil condition on that day, or you might have historical results from the past of what your soil condition was, or if you planted this seed last year, how did it grow? The farmer may have all of that electronic information as well, and many other.
So we're here today talking about the way that we can get from drone to tractor with the EB Ag. I'm here with Ben. My name is Nathan, and we're just going to kind of go through the workflow and how this happens. So the steps that it's going to take to get this done from drone to tractor is we're going to first start out by taking the EB, flying the area and surveying it. We'll do a quick analysis right here on the field, and then scout that area and see some of the areas that we're interested in. From there, we're basically just going to make a nice prescription in the office, put some values to it, then bring it to the tractor, and then we should be working by this afternoon here real quick.
Okay, so we're not going to show the drone flying in this one, but just showing how they would use the data that was collected by this drone in the farm. One more.
So what you can see right now is we've got this broke down into 5 classes from red to green. Each one's broken out in equal area parts. On the 0 areas, we probably put about 0 fertilizer, since those areas were probably drowned out. But on these areas, perhaps maybe 50, 40, 30, and 20 on the way up to our better ground that we conserve our fertilizer. So we hit export, and the file's already created. We put all of our instructions on here. We have shape files loaded. All we have to do is put it on the tractor and go out and spread. Now load the prescription, and we're ready to go.
So I can sit here and tell you, but it's sometimes fun to see the actual use on the farm. So what can precision agriculture and using drones to help with precision agriculture do? Well, it could help increase yields, which is important as our planet needs more food. Reduce the environmental impact if you're right-sizing the amount of fertilizer that's being applied on farms so that you're only treating the actual plants who need it, save money on fertilizer or pesticides or other things. And there's a lot of international desire for using precision agriculture to help in some of the developing areas of the world, which we'll see being used especially going forward. So I gave one example of using drones with infrastructure. Some of the other areas, and we're going to have a great representation by Xcel Energy at our next panel, so I'm not going to talk about this too much, but to inspect distribution lines or wind towers or solar, as I talked about, to assess for storm damage is a big helpful use of drones. Surveying construction and use in security, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. I just wanted to show you, I think this video is going to start as soon as I go. I wanted to just show you some of the imagery that you might see from a drone if you were using it to inspect distribution lines. Maybe not. So as you can see, what used to involve a person climbing up there or using equipment to get up there or using a helicopter or some other aircraft to fly over it can be seen pretty well with a drone with a camera. So now we're going to talk about some of the key legal issues. And as we talk about these, there's a lot of complexity in this whole ecosystem of drones that I think is important to keep in mind. You could see when I talked about precision agriculture and also for infrastructure, the number of different parties involved with using these. It's not just the drone operator, it's not just the software provider. There's a lot of different people involved. There are a lot of different types of data. So we've got data about what's happening to my corn crop, but we've also got data about where is this land and who owns it, and more personal information that we'll be talking about. One of the interesting things about working in agriculture is that farms sort of blend personal with business. You know, for a business that's not a farm, it's a little clearer cut that we're talking about business information. When you're talking about a farm, someone might live on the property. There's personal information that's more connected with flying a drone over a farm than it would be if it were some other type of business. And then with any new technology, the law is always far behind. So we're seeing that here. I mean, obviously the FAA is trying, but the technology can do more than the law is ready to deal with. So we're going to talk about IP, privacy, licensing, regulations, and we'll talk briefly about state and federal drone laws. And for the agriculture industry, I wanted to just raise the question. There's a lot, and this is a pretty controversial issue in agriculture, is who owns the data that's coming off of farms. And I just wanted to raise the fundamental question of, is it really a problem or is it an opportunity to share information about your farm? And I understand that it can feel very personal and tied to your business, but in a lot of these uses, these amazing things we can do with precision agriculture, you will really only get the benefit of your data if you're willing to share it. So we're going to talk about how people could become more comfortable sharing their farm data. So for instance, research or benchmarking, you could really only get the benefit if you're sharing your data. And one of the other issues that pervades all of this is the difficulty of companies or farmers negotiating one-on-one license agreements with all these different providers we talked about. It will be much easier for the industry if we can agree to some standards and have some agreements that are sort of standardized. So when we first started talking about using drones commercially a couple years ago, the question was, is the data that's collected by drones protectable intellectual property of the farmer? And thinking about all the different types of intellectual property, I think the only one that could possibly apply would be trade secret law in the US. And I put the definition from the Uniform Trade Secret Act up here, and the key pieces I've highlighted is information that derives independent economic value from not being generally known or readily ascertainable. We'll talk about the readily ascertainable part, is the subject of efforts that are reasonable under the circumstances to maintain its secrecy. So it obviously doesn't address farm data or help us much with the specifics of agricultural data, but the readily ascertainable part and the efforts to maintain secrecy become kind of difficult when you're talking about open land that can be seen from the sky. Some farm data might qualify as a trade secret, such as, if the farmer's been keeping track of how much fertilizer they've applied to different parts of their plot, and they have records of that, and they haven't shared it with anyone, and it's been kept secret, or they've only shared it under license with confidentiality provisions, that could be a trade secret. But my conclusion, and I'll explain it, is that information collected by drones flying over farms is not likely to be protected as a trade secret. So if trade secret won't work to protect farm data, what about real property? So if I own the land, don't I own all the data that comes off of it? And so one of the things we think about is, well, if you own the land, how far up above the land does your ownership go? And so just looking at some examples, the FAA, I think as Thad mentioned earlier, claims to own everything from the ground to near space, or to be able to regulate, sorry, not own. So that would be one interpretation that could say you actually own your land, but anything above it is, not yours. Some courts have used a 500-foot mark. There's a Supreme Court case that I mentioned here where they said the landowner owns at least as much space above the ground as he can occupy or use. And you'll see some state drone laws that talk about you can't look at anything that couldn't be seen from the ground. So if someone has a big fence up and you can't see over it from the ground, you can't fly a drone and get that information there either. But even if you own that space, do you have the rights to the data collected from it? So in thinking about some of the laws that could be helpful in this question, I looked at trespass and nuisance, and these are state laws, so they vary in how they're stated among different states. But for both of them, even if someone could win a case to say a drone has been represented a trespass or a nuisance, they would be subject to paying damages. It wouldn't really talk about the ownership of the data that's coming off of the land. So I don't think they're actually that helpful to us. In addition, the practical reality is that you could look on to someone's land from an adjacent parcel with a drone, and that would not represent these two things. And you can fly drones at heights where they're very difficult to detect, as has been mentioned previously. So the Farm Bureau has put out a video that raises some really interesting questions about farm data, and I wanted to play that for you now.
What is big data for agriculture? It's the catchphrase used for collecting and analyzing data generated by farmers when information is taken from planters, sprayers, combines, and other equipment. That data is generally wirelessly transferred to an ag tech provider. Collecting data in precision ag aren't new, but storing and analyzing the data so that the output is more than just a pretty map is in its infancy. Data can now be manipulated, interpreted, and used. It offers opportunities for farmers to apply fewer inputs, use less water, be more efficient, produce higher yields, and ultimately make higher profits. But the technology also brings risks. Farmers need to know who controls their data, who can access it, whether the aggregated or individual data can be shared or sold, whether it will be subject to a Freedom of Information Act request, whether it's accessible to government agencies like the EPA, and whether it could be used by ag tech providers to speculate in the commodities market. But considering control of data, you must determine who owns my data. If you ask an ag tech provider, the answer is almost always the farmer owns the data. If only it were that simple. Certainly that's what most want to hear, but a more clear-cut answer would be, you own your data if you own the data. Varying circumstances can make it almost impossible for an ag tech provider to say who owns the data. Consider a few scenarios. Does the landowner own the data or the tenant? What if you crop share? Does the co-op that applies the fertilizer own the data or the farmer who pays for the application? Or do they both own it? Does the owner of the precision ag hardware that collects the data own it, or the farmer on whose land the equipment is used? If the tenant owns the data, and the landlord is later required to prove compliance with an environmental reg, will he or she have the information to be able to do so? If the landowner owns the data, does that lead to higher rental rates for the tenant? Farmers need to talk to those with whom they do business and make sure that their contract or lease is explicit about who owns the data. This has to be done before you can truly address how long the owner of the data actually controls the data and what type of ag tech provider is right for you.
So perhaps your brain is spinning a little bit after seeing that. You think about all those questions she raised and think about, what would a court do? There's so much unpredictability. There's so many different variations in how the equipment's used and what the law might say, so that ultimately one of the very practical solutions is to have a contract, so that we can reduce the uncertainty. We can have an agreement that pretty clearly says what's going on and who owns or has the right to use or controls or can license the data. And because there are so many different players in this industry, there might need to be multiple agreements. So the hardware provider might have to have an agreement with the software provider, and the software provider might have to have an agreement with the agronomist, and the agronomist might have an agreement with the farmer that they're helping. But all of that will help clarify things and not leave us in this really murky land that we're in right now. And perhaps I think maybe thinking less about who owns it and thinking more about what can someone do with it is a more helpful way to think about it. Who can use it and what can they do with it? And those would be the kind of things you would want to capture in an agreement. Now, the Farm Bureau has just recently come out with something they call the Ag Data Transparency Evaluator, where ag tech providers can submit their apps and answer a bunch of questions about their data practices. And then they get a certificate of compliance, or it's actually a little bit less of a qualitative review than that, but you might want to check that out if you're an ag tech provider. Another thing I mentioned before was having standards, or having ways for all these different systems to connect well together. And so there are some groups that are working on standards, and I've put the names of some of the groups that are working on that here. And in addition, some private companies are working on connecting their platforms as well. And Monsanto is actually building an open platform right now, which they describe as kind of similar to, if you think of Apple's App Store, where third parties can develop apps that work with it. Monsanto is talking about doing something like that in ag tech. There are also data repositories that have been started. I think they're all kind of in their infancy, where the idea is a farmer could put all their data in a repository, and then it would be easily usable by all these different vendors and all the ways the farmer wants to use it. Thanks. So now we're going to turn to privacy. And there's a lot that's been happening in this area for drones this calendar year. We'll talk about the framework and what has passed as a law and what hasn't. Some of the barriers to understanding privacy and complying, even if you really want to comply, it's very difficult. And the types of due diligence that you need to do to get the information that people want, that growers want, or that you need for privacy policies in infrastructure uses and legal compliance. So, as you may know, we have no federal privacy law that covers all privacy. Some other countries and jurisdictions do, but we don't. We have some sensitive areas that have special laws for them. So we have a special financial privacy law. We have a special health privacy law, HIPAA, I'm sure you've heard of. There's a children's privacy law, but we don't have one that kind of governs all of our personal information. There are lots of states who have types of privacy law that deal more with your reasonable expectation of privacy, which are very relevant for drone considerations. The main federal regulator of privacy is the Federal Trade Commission, although some other regulators have tried to get into the act in the recent years. And they regulate it under their authority to regulate deceptive or unfair acts. And they've extended in recent years the idea of personal information to not only information that could identify a person, but information that could identify their device. So things like an IP address or a mobile device identifier are now considered elements of personal information, and we'll go into that in more detail. The way that we deal with this in the US is we have privacy policies, and the idea is that you're going to give notice of what you're doing, you're going to give notice of what personal information you're collecting, what you're doing with it, and who you're sharing it with. And then you have to get people's consent, so you've given them the notice and you have to get their consent. And we'll talk about how that applies to drones. Now, earlier this year, the Senate passed the FAA Reauthorization Act in April, and it did have a drone privacy provision in it. But by the time the final bill passed, it was taken out. But it basically required people who were using drones commercially to have a privacy policy and to disclose those same things I was just talking about that you see in website or mobile app privacy policies. And one of the interesting things to think about for drones is facial recognition, and we'll talk more about some technological solutions to that, but that's one. If you have a photo of someone with facial recognition software now, it is considered personal information of that person. What it did contain, which is relevant to us, the final bill, is that the FAA shall convene industry to develop standards for remotely identifying operators and owners of UAS. So one of the issues has been, oh, I see a drone flying over my property. Who could be flying that? And without bringing it down, there's really no way to tell right now. So the FAA is hoping that we can come up with some way to identify it electronically without shooting it down. So if we talk about somebody's reasonable expectation of privacy, and this is important because even though you might not be, so I guess a couple different ways. One, you're intending to collect pictures of people. You're doing some kind of drone use where you're counting the number of people that run by this path on Lake Harriet, and obviously there's safety considerations and all the things Thad talked about. Or you're not intending to collect pictures of people, but they happen to be around and you're getting them in your images. So then we have to think about what's the reasonable expectation of privacy. And there really aren't cases directly on this point for drones, but one of the analogies we can make, which we lawyers are good at doing, is to search and seizure. So I put 4 cases, 2 on this slide and 2 on the next, that I think are relevant and would probably come up in a drone case. The first is Dow Chemical versus US, and it's a Supreme Court case. And they held that taking aerial photographs from 1,200, 3,000, and 12,000 feet was constitutional. You might remember from law school, or if you're a property lawyer, that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in your house, and then there's a part called the curtilage, which is like right around your house, maybe your porch, but sort of right up by your house. So they were trying to decide, is flying over somebody's facility more like taking pictures of an open field, or is it more like the curtilage of someone's house? And they said it was more like an open field. So that was held to be not within Dow Chemical's reasonable expectation of privacy. Then a lot of marijuana cases, because that's what the police wanted to use planes for in the past, was using a small plane 1,000 feet over a fenced-in backyard. So here we've got a fence. They photographed marijuana. No reasonable expectation of privacy in things that can be seen from a location where the public has the right to be. So finding that the public has a right to be 1,000 feet over, even if there's a fence, that was not within their reasonable expectation of privacy. Another marijuana case, helicopter at 400 feet, looking through the sides and the roof of a greenhouse that was left partially open. That was found to be constitutional. So not within their reasonable expectation of privacy because they left it open. And they could see it from the helicopter. And then the last one, which I think is very interesting and may have a lot of applicability for drones, is the Kylo case where, again, marijuana, they took a thermal imaging device and put it outside a home, so right near the outside of it. And they said that that was unconstitutional because the device was not in general public use and the details of the home were previously unknowable. So there could be some comparisons to drones, I think, with that one, and we'll have to see how the courts interpret that as we get to actually having cases. So I talked about some of the changes that have been happening with the definition of personal information, and a lot of them are important for software and hardware providers or people that are using software and hardware in their business. Unfortunately, because we don't have one law, we have to look at a bunch of different places to try to come up with what is the definition of personal information. So I've put some mobile privacy guidelines, which have sort of the latest definitions up here for you to look at your leisure, but probably the place we look the most is to FTC consent decrees. So that's when somebody's gotten in trouble with the FTC, or the FTC thinks they're in trouble and they settle, and the FTC puts out like a final order and they put definitions in there, and obviously that's sort of where the rubber hits the road, so that's what we look at. So I put a definition from an app settlement from December of 2013 up here. And there was another case this year in 2016 where they used the exact same definition, so this is still good. And the relevant ones for drones would be somebody's personal information would include their online contact information, a persistent identifier, like some information that would be held in a cookie, an IP address, a mobile device ID, as I mentioned before, or a processor serial number, something that could identify the device, the precise geolocation data of an individual or mobile device, which is very relevant for drones, and then username and password, and any other content stored on the consumer's mobile device. Now, some of this is more important for the equipment providers, some of it's more important for the software providers, some of it is important for people who might be flying over someone's land with a right-of-way. Here's another definition from the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And you'll see it's very similar, but what it adds is H, which I didn't highlight, a photograph, video, or audio file, which contains the child's image or voice. We're just going to skip through these. You can look at them. But you'll see here, this is a definition from the California Attorney General report, and it also contains photos and videos as a type of sensitive information. And you'll see, if you work in privacy, that photos and videos are pretty much, if you can see a person's face, they're considered personal information now. So if we take this and look at farm data or infrastructure data, what types of information from those slides that had all the color would be most relevant? Well, for farms, the grower and owner contact information, so their name, their address, their email address, their phone number, where they're located, their geolocation, or where their device is located, an image or a video of the person, as I said, device identifiers, credit card information if you're charging, financial information, infrastructure data, geolocation of a person or a device. If you could see a person's face and you know where they are, that would be their personal information. or an image or a video of a person. And then depending on your contract, some of the other types of information might be relevant as well. So let's say you want to be super compliant with this complex set of laws and regulations. What do you have to do in order to write a privacy policy that would cover what's going on here? There are a lot of barriers to figuring this out, and I deal with this every day with my clients. So one of the things you would do is, let's say you're an equipment manufacturer and you want to start using analytics as part of the software that works with your equipment. And so you need to disclose that you're going to be sharing information with an analytics provider. And you want to figure out, well, what are they doing with the information, or what information will they actually be looking at? Then you go to their privacy policy. A lot of times you'll find that they have out-of-date definitions of personal information. I just gave you the latest, but a lot of them are still operating from something from like 20 years ago. So you see the disclosure and you think, I can't trust that. They don't seem to know what's going on in this day and age, and so it's very difficult to get that information. They either have it out of date or it's not really adequate for you to be able to use. And then even if you talk to your developer, there's sort of a lack of understanding of what personal information is. I've had so many conversations with app developers, or website developers, or I say, okay, well, what third-party software is operating on your website? And they say things like, well, we just use them all. And I say, okay, well, how many? And so we start going through item by item, and it's not uncommon right now for me to see 12 to 15 pieces of third-party software that's operating on someone's website where the personal information is being shared. And so then for each of those 12 to 15, you have to figure out, well, what information are they getting, and what are they doing with it, and who are they sharing it with? It's very difficult so the advantage for the developers is these are really cool things that you can do easily on your website because you're just using someone else's technology. The downside is they all complicate your privacy policy and the disclosures you need to make. And then even if they understand it and they want to help you, a lot of times with the object-oriented programming we use today, they're just taking what they call a closed source SDK, which is a software development kit, and plopping it into the website. So they might say, I want people to be able to pay by credit card on my website. So they just take this, we'll just call it like a black box of code, and put it on your website. And even if they wanted to know what's in that black box, they can't see it. So they don't know. They can guess what information might be going back and forth to that black box, but they don't really know because they can't see the code. So all of this makes it really difficult for people that actually even want to comply to be able to do it adequately. And drones obviously raise all the same issues with software that's collecting people's personal information, sharing it with others. So I mentioned doing due diligence on the software and hardware providers. Also, if you're interacting with databases that have people's personal information, you would need to be figuring out what information is flowing that way. If you're using analytics on your website or on your data, you'd need to figure out what they're looking at. Social media connections, app platforms. Some apps can connect with other apps, so they could actually be sharing information between apps. And then you've all heard of cookies or other trackers on websites. And everybody's heard about the Internet of Things, the hot buzzword these days. And it's actually really relevant for infrastructure and for agriculture because the idea is you're taking a physical object and plugging it into the internet. And there isn't a big screen or any way to interact very well with the object. It's just being plugged into the internet. So, for instance, there are Christmas tree farmers who are putting microchips in their trees, and their trees are transmitting things directly to the internet. So you think about, okay, there's personal information probably flowing there, but there's not even a screen, or there's not even, how would you even present a privacy policy to someone who's putting a microchip in their tree? Or if you have a piece of drone hardware, the drone manufacturer could probably have a privacy policy that you would see when you open the box that has the drone in it or it gets delivered to you. But what about if you're a person who's jogging by the drone that's flying over inspecting a power line, how does that person get your privacy policy? They don't know who's flying that drone. You have no electronic connection to them. I mean, I'm picturing like little leaflets dropping down to people saying, you know, we're taking pictures. Here's who to contact if you have a problem. Or I put this joke up from Star Wars of, could we have, you know, hologram images saying, here comes a drone, it's collecting your picture, you know, just jokes. But really, we do have this issue. The Internet of Things provides all these opportunities for us, but we have this issue of how do we communicate what's happening with people's information when we don't have any electronic connection with them. So, in all this uncertainty, what do? We talked about licensing. We could also change the law or pass new laws, self-regulate. We talked about agreements. And lastly, and hopefully not often, disputes. So what's happening right now? Well, the Uniform Trade Secret Act, someone's actually proposed that it be amended to say that certain types of farm data are trade secrets. I put the link to the House Committee on Agriculture hearing where that was proposed. I don't think it's really taken off, but that would be one thing. We could clarify in the law what types of data are considered trade secrets. The states are really worried about drones. I mean, they're worried about the peeping Tom. They're worried about critical infrastructure. And so 45 states have either enacted, or I'd say over 45 states have enacted or are considering enacting drone legislation. I put some of the common themes in here and some that are most relevant for drones. So some of them require that you identify the drone owner or operator on the device. Some of them require that you register with the state, and I would be interested in Thad's comment on whether that's preempted by having to register it with federal, but we'll leave that for a moment. Some of them say the tenants need written permission from the landowner to use UAS on the property. Louisiana actually is the only law that I know of that directly addresses ownership of farm data, and they say farm data collected through UAS belongs to the legal owner of the property where it's collected. So if you're flying drones in Louisiana, you need to be pretty careful there. Texas actually says it's a misdemeanor to capture, disclose, display, distribute an image of an individual or privately owned real property. It has some very narrow exceptions which wouldn't cover most of what we're talking about here. So Texas bears some careful consideration as well. And then this year there have been a lot of laws proposed, and a lot of them deal with no using drones over critical infrastructure facilities. Self-regulation, people are working on it. The Farm Bureau has put out some privacy and security principles for farm data, which you might want to check out. The Open Ag Data Alliance has also put out principles. There's a white paper I put a link to. So there's consideration in the industry of how should this all work and what's fair between agriculture, technology providers, and farmers. But one of the interesting things, I talked about how there was a drone privacy law that was passed by the Senate but didn't become part of the final bill. So what we're left with from the government is something that came out from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in May of this year, and then was updated in June to coincide with the new drone regulations being released. I put a link to it, but it's a voluntary best practices for privacy document, so it's not binding. We're going to quickly go through the highlights of them, but we don't have enough time to cover them in detail. So there's 5 principles. The first one is inform others of your use of UAS. The key thing here is they say you should try to give prior notice of the general time frame and the area where the drone will be intentionally collecting data. Now this might work really well if you're a real estate agent and you're going to someone's house, or you're an insurance agent and you're going to fly over their house to take pictures or to inspect damage, and you can let them know and you can let their neighbors know that there'll be a drone there. If you're flying along power lines and there's people nearby, that seems almost impossible. You should provide a privacy policy if you are a commercial operator of drones. And one of the interesting things they say, if you look at the bullet point that says covered data, is that if you alter the data so a specific person is not recognizable, it's not considered covered data or personal information. We'll talk about one technological solution to do that. So technology can be our friend as well. Kind of how Chris Draper was talking about, if you could stay under 11 pounds, maybe you don't need regulation. If you can avoid collecting the personal information in the first place or immediately delete it, maybe you're in a much simpler situation as well. And one of the things they say is you should be, in your privacy policy, you should say how somebody could submit a privacy or security complaint or concern. The next one is to show care when you're operating a UAS. And the thing I wanted to highlight here was just, it does talk about the reasonable expectation of privacy, so it'll tie back to those cases I mentioned. And the second bullet point, avoid using UAS for the purpose of persistent and continuous collection of covered data about individuals. And here I thought the most likely way I could think that this would come up would be if you had critical infrastructure and you had a drone for security purposes where you had it constantly flying in the same pattern and you're constantly taking pictures of someone's house or their property, you might fall into this category. So that would bear some additional thinking about how you would do that. Limit your use and sharing. One of the key things here is they say if you're going to publicly disclose the data, you should make a reasonable effort to obfuscate or de-identify the data before you disclose it. Security, they talk about the NIST cybersecurity framework as a possible model for doing security. Obviously, there's two types of security. There's what happens if someone captures your drone? Can they get the information off of it? And there's also what happens with the software that's going to have data coming from the drone. And then, keep up with the laws that are passing. I put the list of companies and individuals or, organizations that supported this. You'll see Amazon and Google X on there as some media organizations as well. So how can you reduce your risk if you're an infrastructure user? One thing you can do is fly over your own land or your own right-of-way. That'll simplify things. Technological solutions. I put a link here to a very interesting paper that just got released that talks about some of the technologies that are coming that will help with some of these privacy concerns. So they talk about geofencing, which Chris Draper talked about, both for compliance and safety uses. It allows you to upload to your drone where can you fly, and then that would help having it not go in places where it shouldn't be flying. It talks about ways that you can delete data that's been collected that you didn't intend to collect, like pictures of people, and some interesting technologies that are going to come out to help you avoid collecting that kind of data in the first place. A lot of drones right now are operated by avoiding objects or structures, and they're talking about instead having drones that operate through free space so that you are kind of targeting where you're less likely to get that personal information. It talks about some of the security that's available and some really interesting software that will allow you to obfuscate faces. So even if you collect the face in the first place, it will allow you to quickly get rid of it. So I would recommend that paper, and we'll see more, I'm sure, as we go. Provide notice. We talked about the difficulties, but that's the ideal. You have a privacy policy. Use special care if you're releasing information to the public. And then the persistent and continuous uses may be the highest risk. So in conclusion, both the intellectual property and privacy issues regarding drone data are uncertain under the law. There's a lot of due diligence that's required if you want to be able to answer questions from producers about what's happening with their data, or to draft a privacy policy that covers that. The tech providers really need to get a grip on what's happening with their data because they're going to need it to answer all those questions. And helping all this industry that's here, if you can help with the standards development and legislative action, you're going to end up with something that will work much better for your business. We talked about focusing on the user agreements and agreements between companies, and giving notice, having privacy policies, and following those best practices will definitely help reduce your risk. Thank you very much. I think we're a little over, but I'll be up here if anyone has questions they'd like to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And we will be back at 11 o'clock.